This is part 2 of my tank valve installation upgrade. If you've not seen part 1, I'll put a link here for that. And this is beginning of the installation phase. And the first thing to be determined is whether or not I can use the cable pull valves or if I have to completely remove those and install manual valves. And it should go without saying that you ought to have this thing winterized and empty before you try this. And that's what we did. We winterized it last fall. Well, unfortunately, after taking the valve apart, I noticed that the end of the actuator rod has got a hole in the side for the cable, and the ones for the Barker outer drain requires the threaded end. So these are not going to work, at least as is. Now, I suppose you could thread the end of the actuator, but remember, you're going to be lying on your back, upside down, trying to thread the shaft with a die, and you have limited access, and the shaft will actually turn inside the blade, so it's going to be a hassle to try to do that. It's much easier just to buy new valves if these are the type of valves you have, and that's what I end up doing. I had to replace all 3 of the valves, and I found it easier to disconnect all 3 of them first, and that basically removed this whole piece from the sewer installation, and then it was just a matter of putting the new ones on. Made it much easier than trying to do them one at a time. And it's a little hard to video this while I'm doing it, so I'm just going to stop at steps and do it along the way. And we have the first one in. All in all, it wasn't that difficult. And I just have it temporarily hooked up to power. So we'll try it. There's open. And there's closed. Now it does seem to wobble a little bit, but the whole assembly is kind of wobbly, so hopefully it won't have any problems down the road, because I don't want to crawl under here again. Well, I found that the instructions were not very clear on how to adjust the mechanism, so I'm going to provide the details on how I did it here. To begin, temporarily connect the auto drain to the switch and apply power, then depress open and the rack gear will move out a little bit. You need about 1 inch or so of clearance. And if you're not familiar with the terms I am giving here, consult the owner's manual for the auto drain. Next, assemble the spacer and jam nut to the shaft loosely. Then, ensuring that you have an 1/8 inch gap so that the spacer is lower than the rack gear to prevent binding and damage to the mechanism. Then, press the close switch until the rack gear fully closes and the motor stops. Then, while holding the shaft steady, rotate the spacer until it just touches the underside of the rack gear. Next, attach the hex bolt to the rack gear and into the spacer and fully tighten. And you should observe that the threaded holes on the spacer are offset, so you may have to twist the spacer left or right to get everything to line up with the rack gear. And finally, tighten down the jam nut. And before I secure the jam nut, I have this thread locker called Vibratite, and this is low strength purple. Tighten it down, it should help it from backing off. Well, one thing you want to do, of course, is make sure that there's enough clearance when these come out that they're not going to hit the wires at all. I had to splice the wires because the ones that came with the Barker auto valves are a little bit short. They're only about 4 or 5 foot maybe at the most. And I'm 10 to 12 foot from the control panel to the valves themselves. So I had to splice the wires. And what I'm using is the marine grade heat shrink butt connectors that have adhesive in it. They do take a high temperature to heat shrink, so you got to have a good heat shrink gun. And I staggered them, and you don't really have to do that. But when you wrap it with some tape at the end, it makes for a nice bundle that's not much thicker than the normal bundle. And that way, when you're feeding the wire through holes and things, you don't have this big wad to get stuck. So these are just a couple tips on wiring. And the next step is to find a suitable location for the switches. And these are the switches. And I am actually using this one for a test. And if you recall earlier, I had to extend the cable to the auto drains because they weren't long enough, so I had to snip it off. So I just put some alligator clips on the end of this. And so I need to find a place for these switches. And ideally, I would have liked to put them here, but there's just not enough room. Now, I could put them here, I suppose. However, I want to put my second monitor for the sea level system there, so that's not going to work either. And I suppose this would also be a location up here However, what we have here is where the old valves were, and so it just doesn't look right. So I'm going to actually make a custom switch panel here. And now we've received our custom front panel for the dump station. So I just need to mark it and drill the holes, and then we'll do the cutout for it. And I have holes drilled in here. Now it's just a matter of taking the panel back off and cutting a rectangular square here behind there so that the switches will go through. And at this point I'm going to populate the panel. And I'm going to use genuine Carling contour switches. And there's a lot of knockoffs, but these are the original, and these are waterproof. And since they're kind of hard to find, like all my other projects on my webpage, I will give you a source of where I got all these. So the first thing we want to do is put one in for the gray tank, the galley tank, and the black tank. And they just simply snap in like that. Now we have a light in the top, but not the bottom. So we'll continue on with the next two switches. One of the things the Carling brand switches have that not necessarily the rest of them have is replaceable actuators. And these were third-party actuators that were actually silk screen printed. And they basically just snap on the front. And this is momentary on both sides, so open, close. And again, this light will light when the tank is open, just like they did in the original switches. The only difference is these do not blink. Now at some point I may put a freshwater dump in. I am not going to do it right now, so for now I'm just going to put a blank in. And we also have a 3-amp circuit breaker, and we have a little dust cover. And finally we added an on-off switch here on the left side, and it has its own little plastic cover. And since the back is exposed here, I have to have some way to protect the switches, and I accomplished that by 3D printing a box to go on the back of the switch panel. And I made it in two pieces because my 3D printer was not quite large enough to make it all in one piece. And I had channels in the side, and this will be for caulking, as well as on the top piece. And these are 832 by 4-inch long machine screws. And we'll just use these screws to assemble the box real quick so you can see an idea of what it looks like. And we can cut the ends of these off, or we can just leave them be. Now is the time to cut the square out behind where the panel's going to go. Surprisingly, this stuff can be pretty tough to cut. And I've tried all kinds of different tools, and the one that works the best is this. This is a pneumatic reciprocating saw. And I put a little piece of tape on the end so when we're sawing it, and it's going to kick back. When it kicks back, then we're not going to bang against this, hopefully, and mar it. And I've really not gone beyond the point of no return by cutting that out, because I can always build a new front panel if I ever want to put the original valve back in. And again, for every project that I do, I have a corresponding web page. And I encourage you to go to the webpage because there are many, many more things that are available on that than what I can do in the video. And for example, here's one method of wiring the switches. This is called point-to-point, where you just use terminals to go from switch to switch. And you'll see I show wiring the white wire, and then the black wire, and then the brown and green wire, and finally the yellow wire. Or if you do the circuit board method, that is shown as well. And the switch circuit boards finally came in. This is all they are. And here is how you populate them. They have connectors of the switch on this side, and there's an indication on the board switch side, and then just a connector on the opposite side. And the way these work is this board just attaches to the end of the switch like that, and then that provides the motor crossover circuit and everything else. Okay, so we're back to our panel. And if we turn it over and look at the back side, we do have the switch circuit boards in place. And then I just put a piece of brass here. These two brass pieces are bus bars. And here is the leads to the battery. And we have these connectors that will connect each valve. And then they get pushed into the back of the circuit board. And so I think you probably agree this makes a very nice installation. And finally, we have our panel connected, being careful with the wires, and attaching it with screws. Last step is to test it. Turn power on, and gray light comes on when the valve is open, And the only indication that you have that it's fully open is when the motor stops. And it doesn't hurt to keep this pressed down once the motor stopped, because if you remember my schematic, there's a limit switch that will shut the motor off automatically. So here's Galley and Black Tank. And again, these do not flash like the original ones did, but you know, it's still a good enough indication. And then to close them, you depress down, and then the motor stops, the light goes off, indicating it's closed. Okay, so that project is done. If you've not seen it yet, my schematic that I refer to is on my webpage that is for the project. So again, always go to my webpage when you look at one of my videos, because there's an associated project webpage that gives you a whole lot more information. And I'll provide the link here.